Okay, today we're going to do part 2 about Kilayim, the continuation really, from last time. And one of the things we did not speak about there was about Makayim Kilayim, which is like this. If you plant a tree, if you make a tree Kilayim, you graft it or you crossbreed it in a way that's Kilayim, the fruit that grows on that tree is mutter, and you can even take a branch from that tree and plant it in the ground. We mentioned this last time. However, there is an isser, it's brought in Shulchan Aruch if you want. There's an isser to be Makayim Kaim, to keep the tree that's Kilayim. You can't keep that tree out. So you could take the fruit, you could replant the branch from here, but you can't keep the actual tree itself. Now, most places can take that isser at face value, and they say if you have a tree that's Kilayim, then cut it down. That's it. Uproot it. Get rid of it. You can't keep it. However, there's a bunch of the Achronim try to be Malamed Zchus to give justifications for the common minhag that people just kept those trees. If they bought a tree, it usually wasn't the case where they did it themselves because the Yid wouldn't make Kilayim, but he bought a field or bought a house, and on it is a tree that was Kilayim that the person before him, someone who was not Jewish, had planted. And the Achronim try to be Malamed Zchus as to why it should be okay to not cut that tree down. So the most prominent of those is Chassam Sofer, who says it's okay to keep the tree if you under two conditions. One is you take a non-Jewish person as a partner in the tree, and second is you don't do anything to actively keep the tree going. So it's based on questions in the Gemara what that means, whether Makayim Kilayim, whether you're over the Isra of Makayim Kilayim, if you just let the tree exist and you don't do anything active. So the Chassam Sofer says if you sold part of it to a guy and you don't do anything active to help the tree keep on going, then that's not an Isra Makayim Kilayim, and you can keep the tree around. Chazon Ish argues from a whole bunch of different angles on it. First of all, he says well, when you sell the tree to the guy, if you think that's going to be helpful, that in itself is a Makayim Kilayim. You're taking an action. He says even watering it and other things you do for the tree are also considered actions. So the Chazon Ish does not really accept what he says here. We'll get back to the Chazon Ish a little bit in a couple of minutes, but that's the Chazon Ish is not very happy with what the Chassam Sofer says. Now there are others who give other reasons to say why it should be mutter. Aruch HaShulchan has a chiddush. He wants to say is the Isra Makayim Kilayim doesn't apply to trees. It's only for other types of Kilayim. Again, other types of Kilayim that almost don't exist at all in Chutzar, as we mentioned last time. And Rav Wosner says, well, maybe there is an Isra Makayim Kilayim, but if you get to a point where you can't tell anymore that the trees were grafted, then the Isra Makayim Kilayim doesn't apply anymore. How practical it is, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how long that takes or whether that ever happens, that you can't see anymore that the trees were originally grafted. And I personally have seen trees that were a couple of years old that you could tell, but I don't know really if there comes a point that it becomes so, they become so bound together in a way that you can't even tell anymore. Okay, but that's what he says. Maybe it's not such a thing. But again, the simple understanding is that the Isra Makayim Kilayim is to keep the tree at all. If the person had a tree that's Kilayim, and if you have one in your backyard, you should ask a shayla, bring it to a Rav to see what you should do. Now, I mentioned last time that the concern of Makayim Kilayim or Kilayim itself is most relevant for stone fruits. That is to say, peaches and cherries and plums and almonds, things that have a hard, what they call a stone in the inside of it, a hard pit, usually in the middle. Where there's a very hard percentage of those are grafted onto peach or almond and are Kilayim. So if you're buying a new tree, either of a stone fruit or really of any tree, really, it's within reason that you could find out what the rootstock is. You're buying it from somebody, you're buying it from a manufacturer, you're buying it from a store who bought it from someone. You potentially could dig back and find out, okay, what's the rootstock of this tree that I'm about to buy? But it's not so practical when you, in the case like you mentioned before, when you bought the house and the tree's already there. How are you going to figure out how it was planted 10 years ago? How didn't we even know what the rootstock of that was? Now, it is possible. UC Davis and maybe other universities or others, you potentially do a DNA test on the rootstock to find out what it is. It's a little expensive. That's a possibility. What happens if there's no way to find out? Okay, you're holding by a tree and you just got this tree in your backyard, or the person bought a field and it has trees in it, and there's no way to figure out whether the rootstock is the same as the on the thing that's on the top. So one possibility is to say is we should go basaroiv. Okay, figure out whether more than half of those types of trees are planted onto onto the same type of fruit. Let's say apples. In most cases, apples are planted onto the apple scion is on an apple rootstock, and you wouldn't have to worry about it. In contrast, like a plum, the plums are almost always on peaches, so which is a problem. That it would be claimed. So if it'll be more than half of it is okay, then you're okay. More than half of it are not claimed, you'd be allowed to keep it, and if less than half and more than half are claimed, then you can't keep it. Okay, now, just in that, before we move on, there's a question came up, is, okay, let's say, I don't know, unless it's a suffix, I have no way of figuring out whether this type of tree is climb or not climb. So the question is, do I have a choice to say it's a suffix deraisa, I want to cut down the tree, I want to avoid the Isser Mekayim climb, so I'll cut the tree down. On the other hand, if I cut down a tree that I'm not supposed to cut down, that's baltashis, that's also Isser deraisa. So what should I do now? I can't. So either choice has a potential, either option has a potential Isser deraisa. So Rabbi Milenchuk showed me in the Divrei Chaim, he says, yes, for sure you can cut down the tree. He says, baltashis is, you're only not allowed to cut down, destroy fruit trees for no tzarech. He says, what could be a tzarech, bigger tzarech than avoiding an issur? He says, "Ein tzarech gadol mizeh lishmar misafik issur Torah." He says, so of course it's a tzarech. So there's no problem of batashras because there's a clear tzarech. Then the tzarech is to avoid the issur. Anyhow, okay. So now back to what we're saying. If there's no way to really know whether it is or not, so I said to you could follow Roy, but the Chazon Ish says, I guess if it's a real suffix, Chazon Ish says. If you're not sure, then you could keep the trees and you could even water and weed those trees. And he says like this. He says some people hold the Isser Mekayim Kaim is only an Isser Drabanan, so in which case it's a suffix or suffix Drabanan Bilkula. He says now many others hold that Mekayim Kaim is an Isser Deraisa. He says but even so it's a suffix. If this graft, you don't know whether the tree is climb or not. That's the obvious suffix. And the other suffix is, it could be that watering and weeding are not considered Mekayim Kaim, as I mentioned before, and it could be those are considered like more passive. That's not, so to speak, active enough to be considered these are Mekayim Kaim. So he says if you're being Mesupik, you'd be allowed to keep it and water it and weed it. Okay, now let's move on to some other things. A couple of things. First, two small things. One is that there's a general question, whether a person should say Shehechiyanu for Kiddush on the second night of Rosh Hashanah. And the Shulchan Aruch therefore says, so when the person who makes Kiddush, and the people who bench licht, who are going to make the Shehechiyanu, should wear a new piece of clothing or eat a fruit on which you require to make a Shehechiyanu. So this way there's no question. You make the Shehechiyanu and it goes, first of all, on the Yontiv and on the new fruit or the new clothing, and therefore you have no question that you were allowed to make a Shehechiyanu. So it would seem worthwhile if you're doing the new fruit, which is what lots of people do, as your Shehechiyanu, you should find out whether that fruit was made with Kilayim, because we spoke about last time that you're not supposed to make Shehechiyanu on fruits that are made through Kilayim. So, like for example, just as an example that might be right, and that's like this: the blueberry cactus. I'm not even going to try to read you the scientific way they pronounce it. The blueberry cactus is a common rootstock for all types of other cactuses, and I don't really know, but it would sure seem like it's Kilayim to prickly pear sabras, which a lot of people want to use for as a pri chadash, because the fruit of the blueberry cactus it's called the blueberry cactus because it's got its fruit is these tiny little berries, which are very different than sabra, than prickly pears, where there's these relatively large, much larger, fruit that looks differently. So I don't know for real, but it's very possible that those two would be Kilayim with each other. So I'm buying that fruit to make Shehechiyanu on. Well, maybe that fruit is maybe it's Kilayim, and you're not supposed to be making Shehechiyanu on that, as we mentioned. So to speak, the good news is just bear in mind the Shulchan Aruch says that if you don't have a new fruit or you don't have a new piece of clothing, then you should anyhow make Shehechiyanu during Kiddush. And so therefore, the same is, if you have this fruit and you're not really sure whether the new fruit is a fruit of Kilayim, okay, so the worst is you just made Shehechiyanu on the Yontif, which you're allowed to do if you had no new fruit anyhow. Okay. Another small thing is that we talked about a lot last time about making Shehechiyanu on fruits that are Kilayim. And Diane Weiss says, l'chayr, the same thing should be on the bracha we make once a year, usually in the spring, like in Nisan time, which is when you see the blossoming of fruit trees. He says is that bracha is saying Hashem, it's so wonderful that you made everything we need in this world exists, is out there. You made everything like that. He says, so how are you going to make that for Kilayim? It's like, just like, make Shehechiyanu, like I'm so excited to get to this new fruit, which Hashem didn't really want you to make in the first place. Then the same idea is, we say, Hashem, you made everything the way it was supposed to be. You're not missing anything in this world. That's odd when this is a fruit. This is a fruit that's not supposed to be here. It's made through Kilayim. So the only question is, and that's what he says. He questions that, and the question what we could think about is that whether the rules or the criteria for when to not recite Shehechiyanu on Kilayim is the same as for Shehechiyanu, because we said that you don't make Shehechiyanu when it's made neged ratzon habayre. But if you plant the seed and then that grows into a new fruit, that's okay to make Shehechiyanu on that. And we also said if the crossbred fruit doesn't exist naturally in nature, it's also okay to make Shehechiyanu, since there was no isser of Kilayim in this actually producing this one. It was many generations ago that the fruit was produced. So that last piece doesn't seem to work so well with Shehechiyanu, because I'm thanking Hashem for creating everything that we needed. Everything we needed was created when what was made. Well, this fruit wasn't. This apium, let's say as an example, didn't exist. So it's a little, that might be, the rules might be a little different as to when we won't say Shehechiyanu as compared to when we won't say Shehechiyanu. Okay, and our last thing, excuse me, is about microbial fermentation. That is the classic Kilayim that we've been talking about all this time, is when we graft trees together or we crossbreed trees. I mentioned last time that it's considered Kilayim, even if there's some Achronim held not like this, but it's accepted that it's considered Kilayim even if the thing that you transfer from one tree to the other is something that could not grow into a full tree, as long as it has something in it that is part of growth, a part of reproducing, like koyach ha'ha'ilada, that's considered to be Kilayim. Okay, and therefore, what we spoke about last time was, if I transfer pollen, if you plant pollen in the ground, nothing's going to grow from it. But pollen is part of helping the tree produce fruit, and therefore that would be Kilayim. It's said in contrast, and that's the shayla, in contrast to putting fertilizer. Fertilizer from a different fruit is not Kilayim, because the fertilizer has nothing to do with the making the tree actually produce the fruit that it does. It's sort of so indirect that's not considered Kilayim. That's the Gemara. Okay, so excuse me. So bearing that in mind, Rosh Zalman says that if a scientist grafts genetic material from one tree to another, that would also be an isser of Kilayim. That is to say, before we move on to the finer detail, the point is the genetic material by itself couldn't grow. It's only one part of the genetic material, but the fact that it's involved in helping the plant reproduce, which of course it is koyach ha'ha'ilada, and that's also considered to be, that's a problem of Kilayim. Now, he says usually the rule is the din doesn't care about things that are too small to be seen with the naked eye. But he says even so, if a scientist is sitting and working actively with a gene or something else that's microscopic, he can't say it's invisible, or halacha doesn't consider it to be to exist. That you're spending your day actually patchking with that little thing. He says it's not possible. He says kivin sha'anoshim metaplin b'chalakikim, which means cell particles. Ha'ela umavir noisam min echad l'sheni harizeh choshev mamish kinir le'nayim v'ledom miklal le'toiloim she'inem ner. Now, he doesn't really say where he gets it from. He doesn't really flesh out what the actual logic to that is. He just seems to think misfar that's correct. Rabbi Reese thought it was also correct, but that's what Rosh Zalman says. Now, seemingly, or at first glance, you would think that what he just said applies to the production, the way we make enzymes and other things through microbial fermentation. For example, you take cows. Cows make rennet enzymes in their stomachs, and they make lipase enzymes in their gullets, part of their throat. And both of these are very valuable enzymes for making food products. So the kosher version, what we call the microbial version of this enzyme, is we take the gene responsible for making those enzymes. We take that gene and we put it into some other microorganism, not a cow, not a cow's throat or stomach, put into some other organism, and then that organism now, using this gene, which has the instructions for how to produce rennet or or lipase, it becomes basically a little factory to produce that enzyme that we want. That's a microbial production. We have this microorganism producing what we want based on the genes that we know exist in the cow that do that. So at first glance, he says, well, the genes are microscopic. Okay, no problem. And the cow, if we take it from if we take this from a cow that didn't have shechita, a treif, basically it's treif. So now we took this and we put them to create the enzyme. So it's not a Kilayim. I'm not talking about. We're not concerned here with the Kilayim shaboy, but that teaches us that should be considered to be something actually happened. In which case, basically, we have a treif maimed. We have something treif that is what helped make the enzyme, and the enzyme should be usher. It's not Kilayim. I'm just using Kilayim and Rosh Zama's point that he made about Kilayim to raise the question: should that be a problem for these microbial enzymes? Because the cow enzyme that's in there, that was put into there, should be considered that a piece of treif was put into there, and that's what made the difference over here. So that's what a person might think. That's what I thought when you just first think about it or hear about how this is done. But Rabbi Price explained to me that it's all incorrect. And that's because like this. It's true that scientists use this genetic material to program a microorganism to produce the rennet or the lipase or a million other things that they use them to produce. But they don't take any genetic material from a cow, in our example, to the microorganism. What they do is they figure out which gene in a cow's DNA helps produce this enzyme. They figure out what that thing is, and then they synthesize that genetic sequence in a lab, and they transfer into the microorganism. In other words, the cow, the cow's DNA teaches them what it is that they're trying to create. But the creation of that is all by itself, using sources that have nothing to do with cows. And assuming, of course, if they're kosher, they have to be kosher. But assuming that they're kosher, the resulting enzyme that comes out of that is also kosher. And so the cow is the teaches us how to make this, but it's not actually coming from a cow, and therefore it doesn't raise a concern.